In this edition of Fix the Flick, we'll be looking at 2013's Man of Steel. Zack Snyder's grandiose visual style was a perfect choice to bring one of comics' most powerful characters to life, and exploring the Kryptonian origins of Superman, pitting him against General Zod, was a breath of fresh air for a character that's been popular for the better part of a century. And a big part of that popularity is because of the overwhelming optimism of the character. However, Zack Snyder's Superman was cynical, untrusting, and, oh yeah, he killed a guy. DC, if you wanted to give your extended universe a darker tone, then you should have kicked it off with Batman, not try to make Superman dark and gritty. Because he's not.
You know, you really shouldn't smoke, Miss Lane.
There was, however, a natural way to reintroduce us to the Man of Steel. It should have been a coming-of-age story. The movie should have been about a child born different, and as a child wanted nothing more than to fit in and be the same as everyone else. But when facing adulthood, he has to develop the courage to embrace who he really is. So, looking at the movie from that perspective, let's try to fix Man of Steel. The Kryptonian scenes in the released movie had way too many things going on at once, so let's try to streamline things a bit. When we start the movie, Zod has already taken over the Kryptonian Council, and the fight we're seeing is Zod's regime being overthrown. We start off with a big battle taking place on the surface, while Jor-El leads a unit of soldiers against Zod himself. A huge fight ensues, and the rebels defeat Zod's forces. After Zod and his followers are banished to the Phantom Zone, it's discovered that Zod has harvested Krypton's core to fuel his war machine. Jor-El realizes that this is going to cause Krypton's imminent destruction. So, he and Laura load their infant son into the escape pod, and baby Kal-El starts his journey to Earth. Years later, we see Clark Kent making his way north through Canada. In this version, Clark is a little younger, like college age, because if we're telling a coming-of-age story, the character needs to look like he has some actual growing up to do. We then see the oil station fire and rescue, and Clark getting knocked out. From there, we flash back to only a few months earlier, with Clark and his mother at Jonathan Kent's funeral. Martha asks Clark if he really wants to leave home. Clark says, "I've been hiding from who I am my whole life. It's time to find out where I come from. It's time to find out who I am." Here we see Clark acting very much like his eventual disguise. He's unsure of himself and nervous about what the future might hold. We then cut to Metropolis, where we're introduced to Lois Lane. In this version, she's looking into the cause of the oil station fire. She's a young reporter, but you can tell her investigations into corruption and the abuse of power are starting to wear on her. Nevertheless, she goes to Canada, and when she talks with the oil workers, the story of their rescue comes out. At first, she's extremely skeptical, but when she sees a video of one man holding up half the station to save the workers, she starts digging into the identity of this mystery savior. Back in Canada, Clark makes his way far into the North Woods. Once he's alone, he takes out the command Crystal instead of graphite thumb drive thing because the crystal-based technology is so iconic of Superman. Clark shoots his heat vision into it and the crystal absorbs the energy. He then plants it into the ground and it grows into, you guessed it, the Fortress of Solitude. Jor-El appears and explains that the fortress is a recreation of Krypton's conditions, meaning that Clark's super senses are muted, and while there, he can have some peace and quiet. Jor-El goes on to tell him about his Kryptonian heritage. But just as Clark gets excited to learn about his past, he realizes it's just that, his past. He realizes that this world is all he has now. Jor-El says that even though Krypton is gone, it lives on in Clark.
We wanted you to learn what it meant to be human first. So that one day, when the time was right, you could be the bridge between two peoples.
At Jor-El's command, the iconic Superman suit actually grows onto Clark's body, just like the fortress grew out of the ground. The scout ship in the original movie just randomly being on Earth, and Superman's suit just being an everyday uniform, felt really ordinary. This way, the first time we see Superman, it feels, super. From there, like in the released film, Clark learns to fly while a voiceover of Jor-El explains his powers. As he flies back to Kansas, all this talk about his abilities flashes Clark back to when he was a child, and his super senses overwhelmed him at school. In this new context of Clark feeling alienated because of his powers, the part where he hears what the other kids are saying about him is much more significant.
What's wrong with him anyway? He's such a freak. Crybaby. His parents won't even let him play with other kids. I know, what a weirdo.
While Clark's learning about his past and powers, Lois is retracing his steps all the way back to Smallville. Just like in the original, Lois finds Clark at his dad's grave. She asks him to tell his story, and that weariness we saw in her before gives way to genuine enthusiasm. Lois's acceptance of him catches Clark pleasantly off guard, and they both get a little caught up in their excitement. We start to see some natural chemistry between them, rather than just being told that they like each other. But before they get any further, they see Zod's ship, and Clark goes to investigate. When he arrives, Clark is super excited to learn that he's not alone in the universe. Zod tells him they initially tracked the energy from the fortress, then tracked down the signal from Clark's pod. Now, remember the conversation Zod and Clark had in the original that started all polite and then turned into a Marilyn Manson video about Zod slaughtering humanity? No! Well, this conversation goes pretty much the same. But instead of destroying humanity, Zod wants the Kryptonians to rule over it like gods. In a rage, Clark attacks Zod, and they have the same superpowered throwdown on Main Street, Smallville. The only differences here are that while Clark's fighting Fiora, Zod and Non pack Clark's pod into their ship before they retreat. In this version, it has the humans not as quick to accept Clark. In fact, they're pretty scared and aggressive. In this moment, Clark realizes his anger and lack of control started the fight. Ashamed of the damage he's caused, he simply flies off. Back on their ship, Zod explains the temporary weaknesses of their super senses. But he accesses Clark's pod and says that it's nothing that can't be fixed. Then, using the pod's memory, he starts looking for the Fortress of Solitude. Hours later in Metropolis, Clark sees news coverage of the fight in Smallville, and for him, this is the worst possible scenario. He revealed himself to the whole world, and a lot of people got hurt in the process. This causes a flashback to the school bus crash. The rescue itself was fine, but Clark's talk with his dad afterward doesn't make a lot of sense. In the first scene, Jonathan basically says that Clark needs to hide his powers at all costs. But in the barn, he does a complete 180 and says that Clark should stand proud in front of the world. So, instead, take everything they said at the truck and reverse the dialogue. So now, it's Clark that was afraid to reveal himself, and Jonathan was the one saying it was the right thing to do. That way, the scene in the barn would only reinforce the point of Clark needing to break out of his shell. And back in Metropolis, Clark takes his father's words to heart when he sees interviews of all the people that he saved, praising him for his heroism. Back at the Daily Planet, Lois is arguing with Perry White about all of the Kryptonians being monsters. Lois defends Clark, saying that what people need right now isn't doom and gloom, but hope. Perry kicks her out of his office, and when she goes to the roof to cool off, Clark is waiting for her. She immediately goes to him like a friend, asking if he's okay. And again, this acceptance breaks right through Clark's defenses, and he kind of unloads on her about his anxiety over what the world will think of him. And this vulnerability bonds them closer together. The conversation then turns to Zod, and Lois asks all about him. Is he from Krypton, like Clark? Does he have all the same powers? And Clark suddenly realizes where he can find those answers. So, he flies to the fortress. Once there, Jor-El tells Clark the story of Zod, and how ultimately he was the reason Krypton was destroyed. After the violent meeting with Zod, Jor-El's admission feels like a betrayal. Dejected, Clark asks why he was really sent to Earth in the first place, and Jor-El tells him. It was chosen because of humanity. He says that great line from the Richard Donner film.
They can be a great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. They only lack the light to show the way. For this reason, above all, their capacity for good, I have sent them you, my only son.
Then, the Kryptonians show up. They aren't wearing breathers because the fortress is blocking their super senses, and now Clark has no advantage. Zod asks him why he defends humanity, saying that the Kryptonians are his people, and tells Clark that he has to choose. Clark finally makes a stand and says, Krypton is gone. This world is my home, and they are my people. Zod flies into a rage at Clark's response, and the three of them proceed to fuck him up. Zod takes the command crystal and says that when Earth sees the might of Krypton, they will kneel before him. Jor-El appears and says that he will protect Earth even if it means bringing the fortress down on all of them. So the Kryptonians retreat in their ship, leaving Clark for dead. Zod then combines the command crystal with the ship's phantom drive. They position themselves over Metropolis and activate the beam, which starts growing a Kryptonian continent. We see the same growing pains we did when Clark made the fortress, but instead of some trees getting destroyed, it's entire buildings. Meanwhile, Lois is at ground level, initially covering the story, but when the whole city starts coming down, she's the one running for her life with Perry White, not female Jimmy Olsen. Back at the fortress, we have our last big flashback. Clark and his dad are on the highway arguing about what he's doing with his life, and again, we're going to reverse the dialogue. In this version, Clark is perfectly happy to be a farmer, and Jonathan tells him that he's capable of so much more. Then he tells Clark that he has to decide what kind of man he wants to be, because whether he has good character or bad, he's going to change the world. Then we have the whole tornado scene, and it plays out pretty much the same, except when it comes to saving Jonathan. Instead of hobbling around, Jonathan gets knocked out with Clark watching. Then, as the tornado gets closer, Clark looks around at the other people, and he freezes. He's too scared to reveal himself, and because of his fear and indecision, his father dies. Back in the present, Clark hauls himself up and out of the fortress. He steps into the sunlight, a metaphorical way of revealing himself, and starts to get better. Meanwhile, in Metropolis, the Kryptonian continent is still growing, and when a building collapses on top of them, it's Lois that gets trapped. As the crystals are tearing their way toward them, Lois screams. Suddenly, Clark lands right next to them, and once he digs Lois out, he flies to Zod's ship to stop the Kryptonians. And with the Phantom engine going the whole time, we have an explanation for why Clark didn't take the fight out of the city, and it adds a ticking clock to the whole fight. Finally, Clark is able to get all three villains on the ship at the same time. He destabilizes the Phantom drive, and now everything, even the Kryptonian crystals, gets sucked into the Phantom zone. In the aftermath, Clark goes to Lois. He kisses her and says, "Thank you for believing in me." Sometime later, Lois has written an article about Superman. She narrates over that final flashback of Clark as a little boy playing with a cape. She writes about Superman inspiring us to be better, because his goodness isn't the exception, it's the example of what we can be. She writes that, even though he was born on another planet, this world is Superman's home, and he is one of us. The movie ends with Lois welcoming Clark to the planet.
Hi. Lois Lane. Welcome to the planet.
Glad to be here, Lois.
And we roll credits. So, that's how I would fix Man of Steel. Are there any movies that you think are in need of repair? If so, email me at the link down below or post a comment. And remember to click like and subscribe if you want to see more movies get fixed. Until next time, I'm Mr. Fix-It for Fix the Flick.